When you think of the Rolling Stones, one word comes to mind: chaos. Not the kind of chaos you find in a messy room or a missed deadline, but chaos that felt biblical, dangerous, intoxicating. Hotel rooms wrecked, curtains burned from forgotten cigarettes. Guitars screaming through amplifiers at 4 in the morning while bottles smashed against walls. Nights that stretched on so long they blurred into mornings, and mornings that felt more like hangovers carved into stone. But there's one question, one story that even among diehard fans still sparks whispers. What really happened the night Linda Ronstadt and Gram Parsons stayed up until dawn with the Stones? It wasn't just another party. It wasn't just another jam session. This wasn't a rock stars being rock stars cliche you could dismiss and move on from. This was a collision. 3 different worlds slamming together in the dead of night. On one side, the Stones at the absolute peak of their dangerous swagger, riding a reputation that already felt larger than life. On another, Gram Parsons, the cosmic cowboy, dragging the haunted spirit of country music into a new era, part genius, part train wreck, and already teetering on the edge. And then stepping into that storm, Linda Ronstadt, still young, still proving herself, but carrying a voice so powerful it could cut through the haze of smoke, liquor, and ego in an instant. Imagine that combination. Mick Jagger with his razor-sharp charisma, Keith Richards with his reckless devotion to the moment, Parsons with his raw, vulnerable, almost doomed brilliance, and Linda, the only woman in a room full of men who thought they owned the night, standing there and commanding attention simply by opening her mouth to sing. The truth? That night was more unhinged, more revealing, and more unforgettable than even the Stones wanted remembered. It wasn't about stage photographs or magazine headlines. There were no cameras rolling, no handlers keeping things in line. This was the Stones' inner circle, cracked wide open. Because when you put Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Gram Parsons, and Linda Ronstadt in the same room, with no sunrise in sight, with no rules to follow, the result isn't just music. It's a haunting snapshot of an era when boundaries were blurred, when friendships were tested in real time, and when excess wasn't just a byproduct of fame, it was practically celebrated as religion. What makes the story so irresistible is that it sits right on the edge between myth and memory. Was it just another night, one of hundreds lost to the fog of the 1970s? Or was it something more, a turning point that revealed truths none of them could outrun? Because what happened before dawn wasn't just chaos. It was a glimpse into the cost of living fast, the price of chasing immortality, and the rare moment when legends let their guard down. This is the story of the all-nighter that still leaves people asking, decades later, was it just a party or the night that changed everything? To understand the weight of that night, you need to freeze the frame and picture where everyone stood in the early 1970s. This wasn't just another chapter in rock history. This was the exact moment when reputations were colliding, egos were colliding, and entire genres were colliding under one roof. The Rolling Stones weren't just famous. They were infamous. By this point, their reputation for excess had outgrown even their music. They weren't just the bad boys of rock. They were living, breathing symbols of danger. People didn't go to a Stones show just to hear songs. They went to witness madness, to see how far the band could stretch the limits of human indulgence before snapping. Exile on Main Street was cooking, a record born out of chaos, exile, and tax evasion in the south of France. Keith Richards was living half his life in a haze, sliding between genius and oblivion like it was a tightrope only he could walk. And Mick Jagger? Mick had become something colder, sharper. He wasn't just a frontman anymore. He was playing the role of an untouchable monarch, charismatic, magnetic, but also almost cruel in the precision with which he controlled his image. The Stones weren't a band anymore. They were a storm, and every person caught in their orbit had to decide whether to ride it or be destroyed by it. Then there was Gram Parsons, the outsider the Stones strangely respected. He wasn't topping charts, he wasn't selling out stadiums, but he was doing something more radical. He was dragging country music, the music of backroads, heartbreak, and American soil, into the glare of the rock spotlight. To the Stones, especially Keith, Parsons was a kind of prophet. He had that blend of reckless charm and raw brilliance that made him irresistible. They'd already shared nights in the south of France, trading riffs and secrets, bonding over their shared hunger for music and excess. Gram wasn't just a guest. He was family, dangerous family. And then came Linda Ronstadt. Younger than the rest, but already burning with a talent impossible to ignore. She wasn't yet the Linda of platinum records, arenas, and magazine covers. This was the Linda still proving herself, still learning how to navigate a world where men twice her age assumed they owned the night, the stage, and the spotlight. But the second she opened her mouth to sing, the room would shift. She could stop conversation mid-sentence, silence laughter, cut through smoke with a voice that didn't just fill the air, it claimed it. So when Linda and Gram walked into the Stones' orbit, they weren't stepping into a quiet dinner party. They weren't entering a polite backstage hangout. They were stepping into a house that felt alive, pulsing with electricity. Smoke coiled from every ashtray. Laughter rose too loud, the kind of laughter that comes from people trying to drown out their own exhaustion. Amplifiers hummed in the corner, waiting to be picked up again at any moment. And hanging above it all was a dangerous promise that everyone in the room understood, without saying a word. Tonight, nobody sleeps. The guitars came out first. That's how these nights always began. It didn't matter where they were, a villa in the south of France, a smoky Los Angeles living room, or a rented mansion with curtains pulled tight against the sunrise. There was always someone who couldn't resist picking up a guitar, strumming a chord to see if anyone else would answer. One chord led to another, and suddenly the room was alive, a recording studio without walls, without contracts, without rules. That night was no different. Someone strummed a country progression, slow and mournful. Someone else slipped in a jagged blues riff, and within minutes the room was vibrating. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't planned, it was chaos turned into sound. Gram Parsons leaned into the microphone, his voice slurred but still soulful, like he was dragging every ghost of country music into that smoky room. He didn't just sing, he lived inside every word. And beside him he pulled Linda Ronstadt into the spotlight. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then opened her mouth. The harmonies she poured into the room didn't just float above the noise, they cut through it like a blade. Even the Stones, men who had heard everything, who had shared stages with every legend, stopped. Heads turned, conversations froze. For a moment, even the clinking of bottles went silent. Linda's voice wasn't polished, wasn't produced, but it was undeniable. It carried the weight of someone who wasn't yet a star but was destined to become one. But this wasn't a polished performance. This wasn't a clean studio session with engineers and second takes. It was raw, messy, fueled by more than just music. Bottles clinked against the floor as they were drained and discarded. Smoke curled and thickened until the walls seemed to disappear. Every so often, someone vanished into another room. Nobody asked why, nobody asked how long. They came back louder, wilder, more unhinged. The music always resumed, but the energy shifted each time, as if the night itself were deciding who would burn brightest and who would fall apart. Keith Richards was transfixed. Gram Parsons wasn't just another singer to him. He was a mirror. Keith saw in Gram the same devotion, the same obsession with music and danger, the kind of reckless pursuit that made survival secondary to the song itself. To Keith, Gram wasn't just a drinking buddy. He was proof that someone else understood the madness. Mick Jagger, meanwhile, kept his eyes on Linda. He wasn't oblivious to talent. He recognized it instantly, the way a shark senses blood in the water. He didn't need to say a word. The way he leaned forward, the way his expression sharpened, it was clear. He knew she was something rare, something powerful, and he was calculating just how much the world would soon realize it too. The night spiraled. Songs turned into arguments. Arguments cracked into laughter. Laughter erupted into shouting, and then just as suddenly, everyone was singing again. The rhythm was chaos itself, unpredictable, intoxicating, impossible to resist. Nobody cared about tomorrow. Nobody cared about schedules, careers, or reputations. In that moment, nothing existed outside that room. The only thing that mattered was surviving until dawn, and making sure the music never stopped, no matter the cost. But here's the part people don't always tell. Beneath the laughter, beneath the haze of smoke and the half-finished songs, there were cracks forming. On the surface, it looked like another night of music and madness. But if you looked closer, if you peeled back the layers of noise, you could see the fractures spreading. Gram Parsons wasn't just partying, he was unraveling. Every drink, every line, every sleepless night wasn't just fun anymore. It was another knot in the rope pulling him down. Addiction was tightening its grip around him, and the Stones' circle with its endless supply of temptation wasn't helping. What might have looked like camaraderie to an outsider was in truth a dangerous enabler. Keith Richards didn't see it that way, at least not yet. To him, Parsons was more than a guest. He was a brother, a fellow outlaw with music in his blood and rebellion in his bones. Keith was captivated by Gram's conviction that country and rock weren't enemies but soulmates. But to the rest of the Stones, that bond was beginning to look like a problem. Mick Jagger in particular wasn't blind. He saw Gram not as a muse but as a distraction, a bad influence, a weight dragging Keith further into chaos at a time when the band needed stability more than ever. The Stones were balancing on a knife's edge. Legally, financially, musically. The last thing Mick wanted was an outsider amplifying Keith's worst impulses. To him, Gram wasn't bringing inspiration. He was bringing danger. And in the middle of it all was Linda Ronstadt. She wasn't a veteran of this world yet. She hadn't built the armor you need to survive nights like this. She was still a newcomer, still proving herself, still figuring out how to walk into a room where legends lived like gods. She later admitted that being around the Stones was overwhelming, like being caught in a hurricane you couldn't escape. You could stand in the center, wide-eyed, trying to hold your ground, but eventually the winds would carry you whether you wanted them to or not. The energy in the room shifted as the hours dragged on. The laughter grew sharper, edged with tension. The music turned from joyful to jagged, as if each chord carried an argument hiding underneath. You could feel loyalties being tested. Keith pulled closer to Gram, Mick pulling away, Linda hovering somewhere in the middle, absorbing it all and quietly making mental notes about what fame could do to people. The truth? That all-nighter wasn't just a night of fun. It was a warning, a glimpse into the fractures already beginning to split friendships, test loyalties, and threaten futures. For Gram Parsons, it was another step closer to the edge, another night lost to the spiral he would never fully escape. For Linda Ronstadt, it was a haunting lesson, a reminder that fame, power, and excess didn't just build careers, they could consume them. And for the Rolling Stones, it was proof that even they had limits. Limits they didn't like seeing someone else cross, because deep down they knew how close they were to crossing them themselves. When the sun finally rose, the scene looked less like rock and roll glamour and more like wreckage. The night that had once roared with guitars and laughter had collapsed into silence, and the morning light was merciless. It spilled across empty bottles that littered the tables, across ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts, across plates of food that had gone untouched for hours. Guitars sat abandoned in corners, some still plugged in, their amps buzzing faintly like they hadn't realized the party was over. The air was thick, stale smoke, stale liquor, stale energy. The laughter that had once rattled the walls was gone. What replaced it wasn't peace, wasn't relief, it was silence. Heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence that falls when people have pushed themselves too far and know it, even if they won't say it out loud. Linda Ronstadt looked at that room and saw more than just exhaustion. She saw the truth. She walked away from that night with more than a story to tell. She walked away with clarity. For Linda, it was a moment of reckoning. She understood in her bones that she could never let herself be swallowed whole by the same machine that was consuming everyone else. She had seen how easily the chaos could turn from intoxicating to destructive. And she promised herself quietly, firmly, that her career would skyrocket. Yes, but it would do so on her terms. Not the Stones' terms. Not Parsons' terms. Not the industry's terms. Hers. Gram Parsons didn't walk away as cleanly. For him, mornings like this weren't warnings, they were habits. Every night that bled into day pushed him deeper into the abyss, one step closer to the line he would never be able to uncross. To Keith Richards, Gram was a brother, but to history, he would become a cautionary tale. Within just a few years, Parsons would be gone, dead at 26. Another casualty of a generation that believed it could outrun death forever, only to discover that death never missed a step. And the Stones? They survived, as they always did. That was the paradox of the Rolling Stones. They fed off chaos, they thrived in destruction, and somehow they always managed to rise from the wreckage still standing. It wasn't luck, it was instinct. The Stones had an ability, perhaps a curse, to dance with danger without letting it kill them. But that didn't mean the night vanished from memory. It lingered. Keith Richards carried Parsons with him long after the laughter had faded, long after the world moved on. Gram's songs, Gram's ghost, Gram's collapse, it all remained with Keith, stitched into the fabric of his life. And Mick Jagger, for all his control, for all his cold calculation, never forgot the voice of the young woman who had walked into a room full of giants and stolen it. Linda Ronstadt's harmonies had cut through the smoke that night, and decades later, the memory of that sound still haunted the people who heard it. That morning after wreckage wasn't just the end of a night. It was a mirror, reflecting what each of them would carry forward. Linda with her clarity, Gram with his demons, the Stones with their scars. So what really happened that night when Linda Ronstadt and Gram Parsons pulled an all-nighter with the Rolling Stones? On the surface, it looked like just another party. Another night of guitars echoing off the walls, laughter cutting through the smoke, and chaos that blended into morning. And in a decade overflowing with nights like that, maybe it should have been forgotten. Maybe it should have been just another entry in the endless list of wild rock and roll stories. But beneath the noise, something more profound was taking place. It wasn't just a party. It was a crossroads. It was the night Linda Ronstadt realized her power. She wasn't just a guest, wasn't just the young singer swept into the hurricane of the Stones. In that smoke-choked room, her voice proved it could silence legends, could command attention in a world designed to drown people out. That night, Linda saw a glimpse of the future. Hers, a career that would not only rise but dominate, built not on chaos but on control, on artistry, on discipline. It was the night Gram Parsons edged closer to tragedy. Every chord he strummed, every drink he swallowed, every wild laugh he gave was another step down a road he couldn't turn back from. For Gram, that night was one more link in a chain pulling him toward the abyss. And yet in the music, in the brief harmony of it all, you could hear why people loved him, why Keith Richards clung to him like a brother. Gram wasn't just a musician, he was a warning wrapped in a melody. And it was the night the Stones stared into a mirror they didn't like. Keith, drawn to Gram like a moth to a flame, saw in him both brilliance and destruction, and knew deep down how much of that same fire lived inside himself. Mick, watching from across the room, recognized both the danger and the promise in what unfolded. He saw Gram as a distraction, Linda as a revelation, and the band itself teetering on the edge of something that could either cement their immortality or shatter them. Maybe that's why the story survives, because it wasn't just about music. It was about the cost of chasing immortality, about the razor-thin line between brilliance and self-destruction, about how even the brightest rooms can hold the darkest shadows. Linda would go on to become one of the greatest voices of her generation, a powerhouse who built her career on clarity, not chaos. Gram would fade into myth, a ghost haunting the edges of rock history. His influence felt long after his life ended too soon. And the Stones? They would keep rolling, scarred but unbroken, forever feeding on chaos but never letting it kill them. But for one night, one unforgettable, unbelievable night, they were all just people. Not icons, not legends, just human beings trapped in the same storm, chasing the same high and watching the same sunrise. And that's the haunting truth. The music may have ended, but the echoes of that night have never stopped. They linger still in every whispered story, in every faded photograph, in every song that carries the weight of brilliance touched by danger.